Telling the story of Monticello and most plantations involves not only the people who owned it, but the enslaved people who worked and lived there. The Legacy of Slavery exhibit at Monticello introduces us to some of the enslaved families that worked for Thomas Jefferson. I'm the NYC Traveler, and we're in Virginia. Unlike some pre-Civil War plantation owners, Jefferson encouraged some lifelong relationships between his enslaved servants, if he could, even though slaves were not legally allowed to marry. That is not to say that some families were not torn apart through selling, but there were generations of families that were at Monticello. There are records of enslaved families who were part of Monticello for generations. Not only that, these relationships would help economically, producing more persons that he would not have to buy. Thomas Jefferson was born on his father's plantation, Shadwell. One of his closest servants, Jupiter, was born the same year and grew up with him. He became Thomas's property when Jefferson turned 21 and came into his full inheritance after his father died when he was a teenager. They traveled around together, with Jupiter serving as sort of a valet. Jupiter was a groomsman, stable hand, and a stonecutter who worked on the remodeling of Monticello. He loved horses so much that he even defied Jefferson himself, risking punishment when he refused to release a horse to one of the young boys upon Jefferson's command. He thought the horse would be ruined. Jefferson was very angry and reprimanded him for it, but later agreed that Jupiter was right. Suk was the wife of Jupiter. She came from John Wells, Mrs. Jefferson's father, in 1774. In 1800, Jupiter and Suk and one of their sons became very ill and they all died. Only one of their 3 children lived to adulthood. The Grangers were headed up by Ursula and George. George was an overseer, actually, the only enslaved one. Ursula was a cook, among other things. She preserved meat, washed and ironed, and was a pastry cook. And she was trusted to make and bottle cider. Trusting Ursula to do certain things is mentioned several times in quotes within exhibits, as if there are notes or letters written by Jeffersons of the faith that they had in her to complete tasks correctly, honestly, and efficiently. Their sons were Bagwell, who worked on one of the farms, George Jr., and Isaac. George Jr. and Isaac were blacksmiths. Ursula, George Sr., and George Jr. fell ill and all died after a healer's treatments failed. Bagwell was sold with the estate after Jefferson's death. Isaac, his wife, and children were given to the youngest Jefferson daughter, Mary, also known as Maria. Isaac, his wife, and children were given to the youngest Jefferson daughter, Mary, also known as Maria. Isaac somehow gained his freedom and added Jefferson to his surname, living in Petersburg. But it seems the others were sold to her sister and brother-in-law. In the 1840s, a minister named Charles Campbell recorded his first-hand memoirs of Isaac. Another Granger, Nanny, was a spinner. David and Isabel Hearn were together for at least 30 years. They and their family raised crops, cooked meals, drove the wagons, forged iron, and even blasted rock for a canal. The Hearns helped to make textiles, being spinners and weavers. Cretia and her sons, John and Randall, and her sister-in-law Mary. As a boy, little Moses Hearn made nails, being recorded by Jefferson as the most efficient. Thrimston Hearn is recorded as one of the workmen for the remodeling of Monticello as a stonecutter. Edith, a daughter, married one of the Fawcett's and became a head cook. She also cooked at the president's house in Washington. Her sister Frances, known as Fanny, married one of the Gillettes and was one of the cooks as well. Both of them cooked in D.C. when Jefferson was president. Sons Moses and James married women from different slaveholders, and Jefferson purchased their wives for them. However, after Jefferson died and the estate was sold, 34 members of the Hearn family were separated. The Gillettes had 12 children, who worked in many capacities around the plantation in trained skills: coopers, cooks, shoemakers, grooms, and in textiles. The members of the family also raised their own products and sold their wares to Monticello, earning money with fish, produce, chickens, and eggs. Israel Gillette, son of Edward and Jane, was a houseboy working alongside the butler Burwell Colbert. He ran errands, made fires, fetched water, and waited on tables. He helped with driving Thomas Jefferson later, when he got older, riding one of the lead horses. Barnaby, his brother, was a nail maker as a boy and later a cooper and shoemaker. As a cooper, making barrels, Barnaby earned money from Jefferson. So did Moses, who it looks like is still owed $245. Israel, Moses, and 21 other members of 3 generations of Gillettes was sold with the estate after Jefferson's death. Most of the enslaved persons were not recorded with last names. In fact, the archives at Monticello have at least 609 names in the database. Names are known through Jefferson's records, who noted births, deaths, and sales. For example, Lewis is noted several times during the remodeling of Monticello as being one of the joiners. After Jefferson died, his daughter Martha had to sell Monticello to help settle debts. There was only one owner before the Levy family owned Monticello in the eras at the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow from the 1860s to the 1940s. The Coleman, Henderson, and Shelton families served Monticello at this time for over 80 years. In fact, once the Levy family sold the estate to Thomas Jefferson Foundation, one of the family members from one of these families gave tours. The antebellum Southern economic plantation system could only survive with lifetime unpaid enslaved labor. The records at Monticello enables us to know more about some of the families that worked there and provides insight to how plantations functioned in general. Of course, most people want to know about the Hemmings family, and we cover them in another video. Meanwhile, at Monticello, check out the exhibit about the legacy of slavery.
In 1993, historians at Monticello started a project to fill in that missing dimension. We began to seek out the descendants of enslaved families and to listen to the stories they told about their ancestors. To date, we've interviewed over 200 people. They tell an American story of struggle to make real Jefferson's words about liberty and equality. After Jefferson died in 1826, the Monticello families were sold at auction and scattered in many directions. Set free with the help of their family, Anne Elizabeth Isis and her husband fought against slavery from their retired farmhouse, a station on the Underground Railroad. Their sons-in-law and a cousin served as officers in the 55th Massachusetts Regiment during the Civil War. After gaining their freedom, both Peter Fawcett and Robert Hughes founded Baptist churches in Ohio and Virginia that still thrive today. Leave this house and all I know. In California, Pauline Powell Burns was a celebrated artist and musician. In Boston, William Monroe Trotter was a powerful voice in civil rights and the founder of the Niagara Movement, precursor of the NAACP.
In the office I'm in now.
It's been over 25 years since the Getting Project began, and participants have started taking the lead on sustaining their families. Some descendants are even reconnecting with branches of their families separated long ago because of slavery. New people who are still discovering their ancestral roots in Monticello are being welcomed with open arms.
You don't know who you are until you know where you came from. I felt more pride at my ancestors. I felt stronger. I felt that what they did just shows their strength of character. It gave them some humanity that I had been missing.
Descendants are passing their experiences and their oral history down to the next generation. Since 1993, The descendants have often gathered in Monticello to honor their ancestors, whose lives and work were essential to Jefferson, his house, and his plantation. Today, these families remember the role that they played in fulfilling Jefferson's and America's promise of freedom and equality.